Have you ever wondered why it is that hope and wonder go hand in hand? If I told you, I'm going to give you a gift after the service, immediately your heart would be filled with hope and wonder. You would wonder, what is Logan going to give me? And you would have hope. You would be looking forward to whatever it is I might give you after the service. Whenever there's a future-oriented promise, our hearts are filled with a mixture of hope and of wonder. It seems to me that if you look at Isaiah's prophecies of Christ, that must have been the experience that the Jews originally had in their hearts. Isaiah told them about a virgin-born son who would come and set the world right again. He told them that a Messiah would come who would elevate the house of the Lord in the latter days. He told them about how all nations would come to the mountain of the house of the Lord and seek to know the God of Jacob because of the rule of the Lord's anointed. And so it seems to me that the original Jews who heard Isaiah's prophecy would be filled with wonder. What child is this? And hope. A child king is coming who's going to make everything right again. This morning, as we're looking at Isaiah 9, verses 1 through 7, I want to try to get back into the mind of the original Jews who received this prophecy. It's easy as Christians to read Isaiah's prophecies and immediately jump to Jesus because they so clearly predict the Messiah. When we read Isaiah 53, for example, and we read of the man of sorrows who was wounded for our transgressions, we immediately jump to Good Friday. And that's the right thing to do, but sometimes we need to just stop and dwell on what the Jews were thinking who originally received these prophecies and try to recapture the wonder and the hope that was going on in their hearts. And I want to suggest to you this morning that as we're looking at Isaiah 9, that they would have been thinking, what child is this? What child is this who brings this light, dispelling the darkness of gloom? What child is this who deserves to be titled with these great names, Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace? What child is this who will rule over David's house and bring a kingdom of righteousness and joy and peace throughout the whole world? What child is this? They would be filled with wonder, as we should be filled with wonder. And they would also be filled with hope. Here is the hero we need. Here is the king that we always should have had, the one who will exercise benevolent rule over all of God's good creation and make things right again that have been spoiled by human sin and corruption. They would have had a wish and a hope and a confident expectation that a king was coming who was going to make things right. So if you will, try to do something with me this morning that's a little bit challenging. Let's go back to Isaiah's day. Let's try to put on the sandals of the Jews who lived at that time and try to think about what they would have been thinking. What child is this? And then we'll try to answer that question at the end. And I want us to think specifically about three things. What child is this who brings this light that is spoken of in the first half of the passage? And then I want us to think, what child is it who deserves these titles that are given here in verse 6? And then I want us to think, what child is it who brings about this kingdom that is extolled in verse 7? So his light, his titles, and his kingdom. First, let's look at his light in verses 1 through 5. Isaiah was prophesying to a people who were walking in darkness. The Jews were in darkness, both morally and spiritually, but also economically and politically. You'll remember when Isaiah prophesied, the Assyrian Empire was the dominant Gentile world power. And it threatened to undo both Israel, the northern kingdom, and Judah, the southern kingdom. And in fact, Isaiah warned that Assyria would come in and shave Israel down like a razor, bringing the people almost to nothing and leaving behind only a small, faithful remnant. And so the dark shadow of the Assyrian Empire cast over all of Israel. The people were in gloom, they were in anguish, and they were in complete moral and spiritual, economic and political darkness. You can see that Isaiah refers to the darkness in verse 1 when he talks about how they were in gloom in Zebulun and Naphtali, in the land beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the nations. That's northern Israel, which would soon after Isaiah's prophecy go into exile at the hands of the Assyrians. So it was a dark time for them. And in verse 2, it says that they were a people walking in darkness. And so if you asked a Jew living in Isaiah's day, what was it like? They would say it was a dark time. There was immorality. There was political and economic upheaval. And there was fear of an impending invasion that would lay low God's people. But in the midst of that darkness, Isaiah prophesies light. Because you see in verse 2, he says, the people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. And scholars point out here that Isaiah uses what's called the prophetic perfect, meaning that he speaks in the prophecy in the past tense about future events because they're so sure and certain that it's as if they've already happened. They have seen a great light. It's as if Isaiah has taken us in the future and he's saying, yes, you're in darkness now, but I want you to see that light is coming. There's coming a child that will be born, a son that will be given, verse 6, that's going to bring light, that's going to penetrate and dispel the darkness. So let's think about the light of this child. Notice in these first 5 verses when it shines, where it shines, and what it does. When it comes to when it shines, you can see that Isaiah in verse 1 makes a contrast between the former time and the latter time. Now we said this when we looked at Isaiah chapter 2, that Isaiah spoke of the days of the Messiah as the latter days. Or here they're called the latter time. It's as if Isaiah is looking at a point in the future that's in the distant future, but it's so sure and certain that it's to be brought to bear on the darkness that the Jews were living in their own day. The darkness is real, but the light is coming in the latter time. That is when it shines. But notice also where it shines. Isaiah is very clear that it's going to shine in Zebulun and Naphtali and Galilee of the nations. Now what's interesting about that is that the first people within Israel to go into exile when the Assyrians came in were the people in Galilee, in the land of Zebulun and Naphtali. The first people to see the darkness would also be the first people to see the light. And so it's going to shine in Israel, specifically in Galilee of the nations. There's an intimation there that it's not only going to shine on the Jews, but it's also going to shine on the Gentiles, as it says, Galilee of the nations or of the Gentiles. But not only notice the geography of where it shines, notice where it shines in the sense of the people on whom it shines. Verse 2, it says, the people who walked in darkness have seen the great light. Where it shines is that it shines on people, Jew and Gentile, who are in darkness and in desperate need of light. Isaiah's imagery of darkness and light is fitting, isn't it? We know that darkness is a fitting image of sin and of rebellion and of the general lostness of mankind. When you're in the dark, you fumble around and you cannot find your way. Darkness is an image of ignorance, and it captures the rebellion of Adam's fallen race in sin. But there's something else about darkness that is rather fitting, and that is darkness also captures the depression of sin, the sadness of it. Not only rebellion, but the brokenness of the world. Now, we know about darkness and the effect that it has on our emotional well-being, especially up here living at the top of the map in Duluth. We know when the sun starts to set in the dead of winter around 4:30 and you have less and less sunlight, that you start to struggle with seasonal affective disorder and you get depressed and discouraged, and it drains you emotionally. And so darkness becomes a fitting image of not only rebellion and sin, but also of the brokenness of the world in which we live and the sadness of it. So darkness is a picture of Satan and his antics, but it's also a picture of the fact that we live in a world that because of Adam's original sin, things are not the way they are supposed to be. When I think about the darkness of sin and its effects, I'm reminded of a story that a friend told me about an experience he had when he was in seminary. My friend told me about his wife who had a miscarriage. And after she had that miscarriage, she went through a long period of time of depression and sadness. One day he went back home to their apartment after class, and all the lights in the apartment were off. And as he opened the door, it was somewhat ominous as he heard his wife in the back bedroom sobbing and crying out to the Lord. There was physical darkness, but there was also this palpable sense of emotional darkness and spiritual darkness. Not primarily of sin, but also of the sadness and the gloom and the depression that's in this world because of sin. Not her sin, but sin as sin. And so it was in Israel. There was darkness. It speaks of gloom in verse 1. It speaks of a land that was in utter and total contempt. It speaks of people who were stumbling around, not only in moral and spiritual rebellion, but as people who had totally lost their way, as sheep without a shepherd, harassed and helpless, in brokenness and in sin. But the light, you see, shines, verse 2, into the lives of people who are in that dark place. And when the light comes, it shines and it begins to dispel the darkness. The light shines into the darkness, and the darkness in this passage is not able to overcome it. Notice what the light shining does. Notice what it does. As the light shines into the darkness, we're told in verse 3 that the nation will be multiplied. The people of God will grow. And as the nation is multiplied, its joy will be increased. Like the joy of the harvest when they're bringing in the grain before an impending winter. Or like the gladness when they've won victory on the battlefield and they divide the spoil, it says. There will be great joy in the land where there was depression and gloom and sadness and total darkness. The light will come. It will shine, penetrate the darkness, and dispel the darkness. Remember, Assyria was going to come in and decrease the nation. The sons and daughters of Israel would be slaughtered and sent into exile. But here there is hope and wonder. The nation will be increased, and the people of God, their joy will be restored. You might imagine the Jew, as they're hearing this prophecy or as they're reading through it, saying, "What child is this? What one will come and possibly do this? Multiply the nation where it had been laid low. Restore its joy where it had been taken away." Notice also that this child would come with his light, ending oppression. It says in verse 4, "The yoke of his burden and the staff for his shoulder, the rod of his oppressor, you have broken on the day of Midian." And not only the end of oppression for the people of Israel, who would be oppressed by Assyria and then later Babylon, but also the end of war. Because look what it says in verse 5. "Every boot of the tramping warrior in battle tumult and every garment rolled in blood will be burned as fuel for the fire." It's similar to the imagery of chapter 2 that we already looked at, where it talks about beating their swords into plowshares and spears into pruning hooks. The instruments of war and destruction become the instruments of work and production. There is a total transformation of light to all spheres of life, individual, family, and society. And the Jew who's reading this or hearing this has to be wondering, what child, what son is capable of doing this? of multiplying the nation of God's people, of increasing its joy, of ending oppression, of stopping war? What child can bring this kind of light to our kind of darkness? And I would imagine that as they were hearing this prophecy, they would have wondered, wouldn't they? And they would have been filled with hope. Light is coming. The light doesn't minimize the reality of the darkness. The darkness is real. We're not saying it isn't there. The darkness is there, and it is bad, and it is depressing, and it is disruptive. But the light comes, and the light always overcomes and wins when it's light versus darkness. What child is this who brings this light? Move with me now from his light to his titles. Because Isaiah begins to talk about this child that is to be born in verse 6. And in verse 6, he speaks of the child who's coming and bringing this light, and he begins to give him titles. Now, these are titles, not names. If I spoke of the great Bambino or the Sultan of Swat, some of you who love baseball would know that I'm talking about Babe Ruth. Babe Ruth is his name. But those titles he earned by what he was able to do with a baseball bat. A name is one thing. It tells you something about a person, especially in a Jewish culture. But a title is something altogether different. A title tells you what this individual is able to do, how he will benefit the people. And so Isaiah begins to lay out the names of the Messiah, the titles that will help the people understand what he's able to do. And it's hard to imagine as you're reading through these titles, what would a Jew have been thinking? Who can possibly assume these titles? Some of them are borderline blasphemous. Look what it says in verse 6. For to us a child is born. To us a son is given. Jesus, and start talking in terms of Jesus. But stay with the Jews and stay in Isaiah's day for a moment. And think with me about these titles given to this son that will be born. There are 4 of them. Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, and Prince of Peace. The old King James put a comma after wonderful and made 5 titles. But the better translation is Wonderful Counselor. And let's start with that title, Wonderful Counselor. The word wonderful means inspiring wonder because of its supernatural characteristic. And counselor means one who gives counsel, one who gives wisdom and advice, as you see in the book of Proverbs. And if you're thinking in terms of a king, as a Jew living at this time, you're thinking in terms of Solomon. Because Solomon was the wisest king who sat on David's throne, and he was the wisest king ever. God once came to Solomon, he said, ask whatever you want. And Solomon didn't ask for wealth and women, but he asked for wisdom. And God gave him wisdom. And Solomon was the wisest king who ever lived. And you read throughout the Old Testament of the impeccable and uncanny wisdom of King Solomon and how it inspired so much wonder that the Queen of Sheba came to learn of Solomon, to see his wisdom and his wealth and his power. A wonderful counselor, one who is able to speak with such grace and wisdom that it inspires a supernatural wonder in our hearts. The Jews must have been thinking, what child is this? Greater than Solomon? Wiser than Solomon? Someone who surpasses Solomon's ability to give a proverb or to ponder the meaning of life, as in Ecclesiastes? Someone who's better at solving disputes than Solomon was when there were 2 women quarreling about a child? A wonderful counselor. Who could this be? But not only wonderful counselor, mighty God. Now we know that this individual king is going to be human because verse 6 says, for to us a child is born, a son is given. Clearly, this is speaking of a human being who's going to rule Israel and the nations. How then can he be called mighty God? Every Jew from as early as he could remember was taught the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. God is God. Man is not God. In fact, if you read through the prophets, you read through the Old Testament, again and again, you're taught this dichotomy. There's God and there's man, and never do the two join. But yet here, a child is born, a son is given, and his name shall be called Mighty God. Some Jews have tried to get out of this, and they've tried to say, well, Mighty God doesn't really mean that this child is called God. It means something like Mighty Hero. The problem is the same phrase, Mighty God, is used in chapter 10 in verse 21 of God Himself. Chapter 10, verse 21 says, a remnant will return, the remnant of Jacob, to the mighty God. And so the same term, Mighty God, El Gibor in the original Hebrew, is applied to the child that is born in Isaiah 9:6 and to God Himself in Isaiah 10:21. What child is this? Divinity, humanity. Which one is He? It appears as if He's both. He's a child that is born, but He is a son that is given. And He is called Mighty God. What child could this possibly be? But that title, Mighty God, not only highlights His divinity, but it also highlights His power, in that it says, Mighty God. Mighty God. Isn't it amazing that many kings throughout history have had wisdom, but no power to implement their wisdom? Other kings have had great power and might, but no wisdom in exercising that power for the good of the subjects of their kingdom. But this individual is wonderful counselor. He has perfect, awe-inspiring wisdom. But he's also mighty God. He has power to implement the wisdom that he has. I think of that movie Braveheart, part in the male illustration. But in that movie, Braveheart, when William Wallace is a young boy, his uncle is training him. And like any young boy, William Wallace wants to learn how to use the sword and fight. He wants power. He wants to be mighty. And his uncle says to him, first you got to learn to use this, and taps him on the head. Then I'll teach you to use this, and points to his arm and the sword. Might is totally useless unless you have wisdom to govern the might and use it for the good of the weak. And here you have a child that is to be born who is wonderful counselor and mighty God, perfect wisdom and perfect power. What child could this possibly be? He's also called Everlasting Father. Everlasting without end. Everlasting without beginning. Father, speaking of all the things that it would speak to us today, to the original Jews, Father is love and compassion and provision and care and discipline. This child will be all of those things. He will be a son in relationship to God, but he will be a father in relationship to his people. It's magnificent that it speaks of him in such intimate terms, such lofty terms, and yet such intimate terms. Everlasting. What do human beings know of everlasting? And Father, we know something of that. There's a perfect conjunction of human qualities and divine ones. Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, and Prince of Peace. Prince speaks of a ruler. Peace speaks of what he brings about. We've seen that peace earlier on with the swords beaten into plowshares, spears into pruning hooks. The nations are flowing into his kingdom and saying, come, let us go up to the house of the Lord. Let us inquire of the God of Jacob. We see the peace earlier on in this passage with the end of oppression in verse 4, and the boots of the tramping warrior in battle tumult and garments rolled in blood burned as fuel for the fire in verse 5. Here is someone who brings peace. Lasting peace. The Hebrew word shalom speaks of wellness of being. It speaks of the way creation was supposed to be before Adam took a bite of the forbidden fruit. No brokenness, no disappointment, no depression, no discouragement, no futility, but a perfect world where man dwells with a perfect God and all of creation flourishes under the benevolent rule of man. A Prince of Peace. Who could this be? Again, the Jews who were hearing of these titles were living at a time that was not very peaceful. A time of alliances and conspiracies, a time of rumors of the nations coming in and wiping them out, a time of great political turmoil and economic upheaval, and yet here is a child who's going to set things right. Light's going to come and dispel the darkness. Titles will be born that will be fitting of his character and his actions. And also you see his kingdom here. Ponder his kingdom. In verse 7, Isaiah's prophecy comes somewhat to a crescendo in speaking of this individual's kingdom. Of course, you can see it's the kingdom of David, as the Messiah was expected to be a descendant of David. It says that he sits on the throne of David. Remember, David once said to God, God, I want to build you a house. And God said to David, I'm going to build you a house. And I'm going to bring forth from your offspring a son, and he will be to me a son, and I will be to him a father. And I will build your kingdom forever, and it will fill the whole earth, and it will bless the nations. So, of course, the hero in this passage is the one who comes and who is the righteous seed of David. If you read through 2 Kings and you see all the sons of David, you see some of them are righteous and that they walk in the ways of David. Some of them are unrighteous. In Isaiah's day, King Ahaz was an unrighteous king. He was trusting in Assyria and not in the Lord, as we saw back in chapter 7. But there's hope, because a true king is going to come and sit on David's throne, and he's going to make things right again. His kingdom will be a kingdom of David. It will also be a kingdom of peace. He's called Prince of Peace in verse 6. But he's also one who will bring peace, as you see in verse 7, that will fill the earth. And notice the way that he brings peace in this passage. It says in verse 6, the government shall be upon his shoulder. We know a tyrant places the government beneath his feet to serve his selfish ends. But not this king. This king will bear the government on his shoulder. He will assume its burdens. He will take to himself its responsibilities. He will take total and complete and perfect ownership of the kingdom to ensure its success. He will also bring about a kingdom of justice and righteousness. It says, of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end. On the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and righteousness from this time forth and forevermore. Justice and righteousness, simply defined, as just doing the right thing. But more specifically, doing the right thing by way of the covenant. This king is one who will care for the fatherless. He will care for the orphan. He will care for the widow. He will care for the poor. He will care for the least of these. This is one who will do the right thing always. Solomon was a good king, but he didn't do the right thing always. His life ended rather poorly. Same with David. We know about the affair with Bathsheba. He didn't always do the right thing. And as good as the kings that you can find throughout the history of Israel, you always see, as good as they are, there's some flaw. There's some kink in their armor. There's some Achilles heel in their character that says, we need a better king. As good as David was, we need a better king. As good as Solomon was, we need one greater than Solomon. And here is the right king, the just king, who will do it right and who will set things right again. Notice also he brings about an eternal kingdom. It says, from this time forth and forevermore. David's kingdom, with regard to David's person, wasn't eternal, nor Solomon's, nor Rehoboam's. The kingdom was snatched at different times from individual kings because of their unfaithfulness. But his kingdom will never fail. His kingdom will never end. And we see in the passage why it won't end. The Lord himself is backing it. It says, the zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. How do we know light will dispel the darkness? How do we know there will be a son born who deserves these titles? How do we know this kingdom is really going to come and nothing will defeat it? The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. God himself will back it. God himself will ensure the success of this king and his kingdom. So if you're still thinking with me as a Jew, can you see why they would be thinking, what child is this? Wonder. And there's a child coming who's going to be like this. Hope. So who is this? Who is this child? Well, at the time of Isaiah's prophecy, the king was Ahaz. Obviously, he doesn't fit the profile. Following Ahaz, there was a righteous king, Hezekiah. But Hezekiah had his own issues, as you know if you've read Isaiah or 2 Kings. Some have always tried to say that Hezekiah fulfills this prophecy. But if that were the case, then this prophecy would be a massive understatement. So what child is this? Jesus. The child that is described in this passage, the son who is given, is Jesus. Only Jesus of Nazareth, who lived in space-time history 2,000 years ago, fits this profile. Only Jesus brings light to those who are in darkness. In fact, Jesus said, I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. Only Jesus brings the light that dispels the darkness of sin and the darkness of depression and gloom. Only Jesus has an answer not only to sin, but to the curse. Not only to rebellion, but to brokenness. Only Jesus is the one who comes and makes all things new. Only Jesus can bring this kind of light that can make the darkness go away. Jesus doesn't minimize the darkness, but he comes to shine his light in the midst of the darkness. In fact, Matthew in his gospel quotes Isaiah 9 in verse 1 of Jesus walking in the land of Galilee. Most of Jesus' earthly ministry was in Galilee of the Gentiles. He did that with a prophetic view in mind. That he was the light. He was always shining light into people's darkness. Whether they were blind, they could see. They were deaf, they could hear. They were dumb, they could speak. They were lame, they could walk. They were sick, they could be well. They were lost, they could be found. They were sick and going to hell, and Christ came as the Good Shepherd and found them. Light. I don't know any light like that. I don't know any king like that who's ever lived. As great as all the rulers that we think of are, none of them bring this kind of light into this kind of darkness. Jesus is the light. Who deserves these titles? Who is the child that is born and the son that is given? A human being is a child born. But the Son is given. He's a son before he's born. The Son is the great gift, as Jesus is spoken of in Scripture, as God's gift to us. For God so loved the world that he gave. Who better bore the government on his shoulder than Jesus? Quite literally, as he put the cross on his back and walked the way of sorrows all the way to the place of the skull where he was spit upon and mocked and crucified and raised from the earth and took upon himself the wrath of God. And therefore, what other child, what other individual in human history deserves these titles? Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Jesus is the one who's greater than Solomon. In fact, he said it. One greater than Solomon is now here, wiser, more impressive in his wisdom and his teaching. When even his opponents heard him, they said, he's different in his teaching. He teaches as one with authority, not as the scribes and the Pharisees. There's something remarkable about this man. Even people today acknowledge it when they say, I love the Sermon on the Mount, even though they don't accept the identity of Jesus. They say, I've never heard a sermon that is that good and that is full of that much wisdom. He is the counselor who inspires wonder and awe because of the great way he taught us. But he's more than a good teacher and a good counselor. He is mighty God. He not only has wisdom, but he has power to implement the wisdom he has. He is not a weak, effeminate Savior, the one you see hanging on the walls in Sunday school classrooms. He is the sovereign God from all eternity. He's not merely the one who is in the manger and the one who hung on the cross, but he is the one who is seated on David's throne, even God's throne, at the right hand of the Father. He is fully God. He is everlasting Father to us, loving and kind and compassionate and gentle. He doesn't break the bruised reed. He doesn't snuff out the faintly burning wick. How well suited this is to Jesus. This is not a denial of the Trinity and calling him everlasting Father. It's not speaking of who he is with regards to God. With regards to God, he is a son at the beginning of verse 6. But in relationship to us, he's everlasting Father, or the Father of eternity, speaking of his love and his care. He's Prince of Peace. He's the one who came to bring peace between God and man. He's the one who hung on the cross. The chastisement that brought us peace was upon him, Isaiah will later say. First, peace between us and God in our hearts, but then later, peace between people. Because when you know the peace of Christ within you, you seek the peace of Christ in all of your other relationships. Jesus was continually saying the kingdom of God is at hand. And the reason it was at hand is because Jesus is the King. Jesus is the one Son of David who came to bring the kingdom. Jesus is the one who sits on David's throne. Jesus is the one who brings righteousness and peace and joy, who crushes the head of the serpent, who defeats the real tyrants of the human race, of sin and death and devil. And the reason Jesus does this is because the Holy Spirit backs his ministry. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. When you think about the virgin birth, you could just read that phrase. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. When you think about Jesus on the cross bearing the sin of the world, you could think of that phrase. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. When Jesus had been dead in the tomb for 3 days, on Sunday morning, the women arrive and the tomb is empty. You can see this phrase, can you not? The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. When Jesus ascends into heaven and pours out his Spirit on his church on the day of Pentecost, you can see this line, can you not? The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. And when Jesus says, I will build my church and the gates of hell shall never prevail against it, can you not hear this line? The zeal of the Lord of hosts shall do this. God is backing Jesus. That's why it's a good idea to bank on Jesus. Because he is the King. He is the one who can bring light into our darkness. He is the one who is the wonderful Counselor, mighty God, everlasting Father, and Prince of Peace. And he's the one who sits on a throne and who brings about his kingdom. And it's increasing. It says in verse 7, the increase of his government and of peace, there will be no end. Jesus described his kingdom as a mustard seed that grows and one day will fill the earth. He's the King. He's the child. But you know what? Having an answer to the question, what child of this is this, does not take away the wonder or the hope of it, does it? Because it's still a wonderful thing, an awe-inspiring thing, a jaw-dropping thing, that Jesus is this glorious. And it's still a hope-instilling thing that Jesus is this kind of King to us today. Let's pray.